Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, What Incentive Travel Participants Want. Thank you so much for being here today as we share some insightful information with you. My name is Terrace Bricker. I'm the marketing manager here at BrightSpot and your host for today's webinar. I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to jump right in. And without further ado, I would like to present our panelists and have them introduce themselves to you. Mike, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Terrace. So I'm Mike May. I'm president of BrightSpot here and get to lead our wonderful team of people here. I was also a trustee and chairman on IRF, which stands for the Incentive Research Foundation, for many years, which means I read a whole lot of research papers for a whole lot of years. And still, I'm a big fan of the research that IRF puts out, which is part of what we're going to share today.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Stan Hershenow, and I am an account executive with BrightSpot. And I'm also, I've been heavily involved in SITE for many, many years, and actually been on the trustee with the SITE Foundation for now 4 years. As it relates to this call and the content we're going to discuss, I'm pleased to say we help fund the research that some of the data that we're going to be referring to today. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dawn Bridges. I'm an account executive at BrightSpot, and I also serve on the board of directors for SITE Southeast as the VP of Sponsorship.
Thank you, panelists. We want to hear from you. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them by clicking on that Q&A button on your Zoom bar. And Mike, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Terrace. So what I'm excited about today is that we're going to review not just the expertise that this great panel brings of insights, but also some of the very best research from both SITE, which stands for Society of Incentive Travel Excellence, that Stan mentioned earlier along with Dawn, and IRF, Incentive Research Foundation. And during the course of this year, both did fascinating studies on what participants would prefer. So, many times the research surveys companies, surveys executives, surveys buyers like us at BrightSpot. But in this case, they actually reached out to participants of incentive travel programs, engage their opinions. So I feel like what we're going to share today is the ultimate focus group from the voice of the participant. So we're really excited. And what we're going to share today in the way of table of contents is 4 things of what participants want. First is around motivation and behavior and how incentive travel affects their behavior. Second will be what they would like to see in the design of the program as far as the agenda, the flow, the activities, the excursions, dinners. Then communications, which I think is such an important topic. I think of everything, it's often the most neglected or overlooked. So we're going to share some insights on what participants want on communications, and then we're going to cover their destination preferences, which actually, spoiler alert, there'll be a few surprises in there that we're going to hear today. So with that, let's start at what the motivational impact is of incentive travel and why it is important. And when they surveyed participants, a couple of things I guess came out of those studies, but also are maybe a good backdrop of what's going on in the business world today. And the first one is, according to PwC, 95% of executives are concerned about retention. And I feel like anytime I read a interview with CEOs and what's important right now, talent is always #1 on their list. So incentive travel is a driver of talent. So we're going to see that in the surveys today. Another stat that's important is that middle one, which I believe came from a group called Leadership IQ, that said as many as 47% of top performers might be looking for a job, which is very troubling. And then the last one from MetLife, as well as I've seen the same stat from Gallup organization, is that 1 out of 3 employees are dissatisfied or disloyal. And that's not just saying that they are kind of mediocre, in the middle, fair, partly cloudy. It means they could be actively disloyal and dissatisfied and creating a negative culture. So one of the things that these research that participants found is that incentive travel offsets many of these things, that it drives culture, drives engagement. So that's what we're going to see, particularly on this slide, that says 89% are motivated overall, which is extremely powerful. I don't think any of us would be surprised if that had been 50%, 60%, 70%, but 89 is a very, very strongly powerful stat on saying that participants are motivated overall. When you break that percent down, I believe it was actually over half of all participants that are extremely motivated by incentive travel. So I think that's really strong. And you know, what we see on the left is, regardless of income and perception of achievability, that everybody is universally motivated by incentive travel. So kind of what we'd expect, but it's great to see the stats that do that, which, by the way, after this presentation, we will share these slides if that would help you justify an incentive trip within your organization. Let's see, the next one that we have is fascinating to me, and that says that non-earners are also powerfully motivated by incentive travel, including 81% would work harder next year. All of us would expect that the winners would be motivated by travel, but I thought it was fascinating to see that the non-earners were also positively motivated. And I think that just shows that they are encouraged to work for a sales organization that affirms them, believes in them, cheers for them, is willing to invest in them with a club trip. So it shows that both earners and non-earners alike are positively impacted. And maybe the reason is this last slide, which talks about FOMO, fear of missing out. And I think those non-earners, they crave for the executive recognition and wanting to be in front of the execs and recognized for their performance next year. They also wish to be part of the experience that their colleagues are posting on Instagram and LinkedIn, as well as, you know, we often call these President's Club trips. So I think there's a desire to be part of the club, and I often see people posting on LinkedIn that they've achieved club status and that becomes a badge of recognition for them. So again, what really struck us is what we would expect, that incentive travel drives a lot of cultural benefits. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stan, who will talk about program design.
Thanks, Mike. I'll preface my comments to say that it's becoming more and more important to consider the demographics of your audience when you're looking at the designing of the program. There's some general differences that come out between what each generation might prefer. And when you consider that by 2025, over 60% of the workforce will be made up of millennials and Gen Z, while baby boomers and even Gen X will be either retired or approaching retirement, what motivated your audience in the past, or what they might have preferred, might be changing. So it's important to note also that over 70% of the contributors to the data that we're referencing today are either millennials or Gen Z. So it's an accurate picture, I think, of the makeup of trip participants in the years ahead. That said, one thing that we don't see changing is the power of the destination. The choice of destination will continue to drive the greatest motivation. The intangible benefits is an interesting one. It might mean different things to different people. We'll talk more about activities in a bit on the next slide. And then finally, I like seeing partner-spouse encouragement in the top 5. It speaks to the importance of getting the partner or the spouse engaged early in the qualification period through some creative communication elements, which Don's going to touch on later. When we look at participant activity preferences, I'm not sure these results are a surprise to anyone actively planning incentive trips today. We've seen this call for more free time and less structure over the past couple of years. I do think the generational differences plays into this. I think immersive cultural activity might be swayed by some of the younger generations. They're very interested in immersing themselves into the culture of the destination. The awards dinner, time with leaders, and group activities, while lower on the preference list, they do show that group gatherings are still important. And I think the key takeaway here is to find a nice balance between free unstructured time, and then couple that nicely with bringing the group together for those functions, those key functions where it makes the most sense and has the greatest impact. To my last point, one of the benefits of a group gathering is that connection with senior leadership. And as you can see from this slide, a majority of participants still do value that face-to-face connection. With the growing number of remote workers in the workforce, this element of the program has perhaps even increased in value. This can be done in a variety of ways, of course, but the key is for executives to make themselves available for those opportunities during the program. An observation and a tip from our involvement in hundreds of incentive trips: the companies that pull this off the best are those where the executive view their role as a host and not a VIP. And that's not to say that executives aren't important, because they certainly are. It's just great when they recognize that the true VIPs on the trip are the qualifiers that earned the trip.
Hey, Stan.
Yeah.
You know, I think this reinforces the section that I covered on building culture, but a couple of other things there. I know we've seen some execs who will give away their suite to the top performer in the group, or say, I don't need the president's room. Let's use it as a reception breakout gathering place. Or executives that will come down to the registration desk when big waves of people are arriving to pat them on the back, or those execs that might host a cabana out at the pool during one of those free times that you mentioned.
Yeah, great points, Mike. Okay, we're going to transition now to program communications, and Dawn, take it away.
Thanks so much, Stan. So program communications, having a well-planned and well-thought-out communication strategy is really a crucial element in a successful incentive travel program. It's one of the most important things, frankly, that you can do from pre-program all the way up to post-program. So when we surveyed the participants, about 62% of them really had a neutral attitude towards the numbers of communications that they were receiving. But that's not to dismiss the 32% group who actually want more communications. And so I think what this really points out is that it's really better to over-communicate than to under-communicate. We all know there's a lot of noise that's going on in the world today in our email inboxes and telephones and text messages and all the things. And so you definitely want to lean on the side of communicating more rather than less. The frequency of which the majority of organizations are communicating is monthly, with about 36% of respondents communicating each month. 26 to 27% are communicating each week. And it really depends on your organization and your communication strategy. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so it may mean that you would communicate more frequently during a certain part of the program, and maybe a little bit less frequency than the other part of the program. So it's really something that should be built and tailored to each specific organization and tailored to the specific goals of your incentive trip. It's no surprise to any of us that our participants are receiving communication overwhelmingly via email. You know, a smaller amount, we were a little bit surprised by how few are receiving it via the company website at only 29%. But I think the kind of the king of this slide, or queen, so to speak, is that direct mail, snail mail is back. And there's a really good reason for this. You know, as was mentioned earlier on the call, getting that spouse or partner or significant other interested and engaged in the possibility of going on this amazing trip is really a key. That person can actually push the potential attendee to give that little bit of extra effort so that they win this amazing trip of a lifetime. And with that, we'll talk about some really exciting incentive travel destinations.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. So we're all three going to cover pieces of research elements here on what participants said about destinations. And I think if you listen carefully, you'll hear at least two things that to me were surprises or a bit eye-opening that each of us will share. So as we look at where people want to go, this is a bit of a mashup of what was in both the IRF study and the SITE study. It's no surprise that beach and sunshine was #1 on all the lists. Most trips tend to occur in Q1 and Q2. And, you know, in those months, many people are craving to get out of the colder weather into the bright, sunshiny weather. So Fun in the sun is very, very often number one. What is surprising on this slide is that international has been zooming up the list. Coming out of COVID, international was still a bit shut down. Back in 2022, we found ourselves saying nearer in 22, farther in 23. And that's been the case. People in 23, 24, 25 are looking farther, and you'll see that in some destinations that Stan will cover in just a minute. Adventure travel is probably a bit of those millennial and younger generations speaking into this. That's also something that has risen up the list a little bit. And then cruising is interesting. In the IRF study, it showed up fairly high, but in the SITE study, it was a little bit lower. And I think with cruising is it can be a bit of a mixed bag. There are some companies that really love cruising. It becomes part of their incentive trip culture. But then there's some that prefer the trip to be 4 and 5 nights, while the very best cruises are 7 nights. They're very definitely 4 and 5 night cruises, but cruise could be a good sampler. We said that people often are interested in seeing new places and seeing new cultures. So cruising can offer that. And then mountains is usually a little bit lower, probably again due to seasonality. If the trips are occurring in Q1, Q2, it could be a little cooler in the mountains. But I think of one tech client we had that they had done beach for 3 years in a row. And in the 4th year, they went to Banff, Canada. They went in June, but that ended up being their highest rated trip out of the 4 years, just because it was a change of pace and people really liked that. So, part of what we'll see here in some of our data today is that variety is the spice of life. So with that, let's see, Stan, why don't you cover some of the specific destinations?
Thanks, Mike. In the IRF survey, they asked respondents for their specific destination preferences. And I don't know that any of us are surprised to see Hawaii as a top preference. What's not to like? Western US in the number 2 spot is interesting, and a reminder, I think, that you don't have to travel abroad or across borders to find a destination that's appealing and motivating to your participants. The Caribbean in the number 3 slot, again, not a surprise. As Mike referenced earlier, beach, sunshine, and international top the list on types of destinations, and the Caribbean certainly checks all of those boxes. I do want to point out Mexico at the bottom of the slide, and this is not to take anything away from Mexico, as it offers some amazing experiences for sure, and covers the full spectrum from luxury to all-inclusive, offers adventure. It's really got everything. I think the interesting and worth noting as we transition to the next slide is that we see that Mexico destinations hold the top 3 spots and 5 of the top 10, according to CVent data, on what destinations are most booked. As you can see, the top Hawaii destination is Maui, and that's cleared out at number 18. Some of the obvious reasons might be trip budgets. While participants want to go to Hawaii, the program budget may not allow for a Hawaii trip. I'll close out my comments by suggesting that program stakeholders consider this disconnect that came out in the survey and determine if this applies to your company. If it does, you might explore some different ways to structure your incentive, perhaps adding a top-tier trip to a place like Hawaii for an elite top-tier group of earners with higher qualifications that might yield some more positive results, not only from that top group, but also, as Mike mentioned earlier, from your other participants that are extra motivated. And then just something to think about. The main takeaway is the importance of knowing what destinations are most appealing or preferred by your audience, and making sure that the destinations you're selecting are motivating enough to generate the type of behavior or the performance you're looking for from your incentive program.
Thanks, Dan. So like Mike said earlier, variety is the spice of life. Even though 55% of folks that were interviewed said that they felt like there were adequate destination variations with their trips, 15% would like to see more destination variation. I think we're seeing that as a result of coming out of the pandemic and having places closed off to us. So I think it's definitely worth talking with your attendees, maybe sending out a survey and finding out and considering varying your incentive trips year after year. And the domestic trip extension, surprisingly, 66% of attendees do extend on domestic trips. I think the even more surprising statistic, though, on this slide is that on global trips and international trips, 70% are extending. Obviously, that's due to the long flight times and the fact that it takes a little longer to get to those places. But what this really says to us is that don't be afraid to offer an international bucket list destination. Even if your organization only has 4 or 5 nights, it can be done. And it can also provide your attendees the absolute bucket list trip of a lifetime.
Dawn, this is an unscripted question, but if you could advise everybody on an ideal rotation of destinations, what would you pick?
I think it really needs to be a strong conversation with the organization, but just off the top of my head, beach, and then something different, either mountain or international, seems to be kind of a rising trend in what we're seeing. So I would consider doing 2 beaches and then something really different.
I hear Paris and Rome calling. Let's see. Okay, well, the key takeaways here that I think are just really amazing is that incentive travel motivates, it drives culture, it enhances retention, creates all of those soft benefits that recent research has talked about. FOMO is our friend, meaning even non-earners crave the chance to win the trip and will work harder. As Stan said, avoid over-programming. We've gone through a period of our life where we've been heavily restricted. We work in environments where our day is very busy. So the results say build in more free time. A bonus of free time is it's free to the budget. So that helps your budget too. Communicate more often and remove friction. Let's see, Dawn said that monthly would be the ideal frequency. Then in real estate, if they say location, 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 in incentive travel, we would say different location, different location, different location. So mix it up, much as Dawn suggested, and then memories and heartstrings are key, whether it's those photo albums or other things that can create a halo effect and a lasting benefit of the trip. So a lot of interesting things here as we get to hear the voice of the participant speak to us today on what they would like to see. Terrace?
Thank you, Mike. I want to thank our panelists for their time with us today. Mike, Stan, and Dawn, y'all did an amazing job, so thank you so much. We're at the Q&A portion of our webinar, so please send us your questions if you have any. I know that we're getting close to time, so if you can stick around for those questions, awesome. If you can't, we understand. You can go ahead and drop off. While we're waiting for those to come in, I want to point out that you can find more about this topic and others with some helpful resources, such as tips to improve an incentive travel program and the top 20 incentive travel destinations page. Those links will be provided to you in the chat, so don't miss out on those. All right, it looks like we got some questions coming in. Let's see. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Look at those questions. All right, so I have a question. What do you recommend for an incentive travel median level budget per person and for a high-end budget per person?
Yeah, I'll take that. That's interesting. I know in our industry, we often think of it per person. Sometimes companies think of it as per couple. But we have a good resource on our website that talks about $6,000 per person as being a good, it's probably a good medium level. It may be a little bit above the median. If somebody was just starting out on a trip and they wanted to achieve value, as Stan said, and go to Mexico, they could probably do something for $4,000 to $5,000 per person. And then if you really want to do something nice and have higher, go farther, better hotels, getting up to $8,000 or $10,000 per person would really give you something spectacular at a 5-star in Hawaii or somewhere in Europe. So I'd say 6 is a medium point and above that for higher end.
Thank you, Mike. I have one more question. So do all-inclusive resorts have a positive or negative connotation for incentive travel programs? That's a great question.
I'll give it a shot, and then Don, you and Mike, you might want to. I think it's positive, and I know at Bright Spot we do a number of incentive programs at all-inclusive hotels. When you think about over the years, the perception of and the quality of all-inclusive has gone up so significantly over the last few years. You now have luxury resorts that offer all-inclusive packages, and the dining has really been elevated. Food and beverage, we hear great feedback on food and beverage offerings. It's, I think once a company goes all-inclusive, it's kind of hard to get out of that because you get comfortable with that, that budget and that pricing model. But no, I don't think any company should shy away from all-inclusives for an incentive trip. That's my thought.
I totally agree, Stan. And I think it's like anything else. It really depends on your organization and who your attendees are and what they desire. But there are some really wonderful all-inclusives out there. There are also some that are not as wonderful. And so that's where you do want to, find the right fit for your particular trip. But there are some really, really great options.
Call Dan and Stan and Dawn to get the right ones, right?
Yes. I think we have room for one more question. So, have you seen the average length of incentive trips reduced post-pandemic?
I feel like they decreased pre-pandemic. In the legacy of this industry, if you went back 10 and 20 years ago, the typical trip was always 5 nights. Somewhere along the way, I feel like it's shortened to 4.25. I think there's a lot more 4-night programs out there now. But as I think it was in Dawn's section that she pointed out, even if it's a 4-night program, participants are extending and making it a 7-night getaway. And so, I think when it's shrunk a little bit was probably companies just trying to figure out how to stretch their budget a little farther. But we see everything from probably 3 to 7 night.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So I don't think that we have time for any more questions. That concludes our webinar. Thank you everyone so much for being on here today. We are going to send this out. It will also be on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for joining, and we hope that you join the next one. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.